The town of Brackenridge was the kind of place where nothing ever happened. Tucked away at the edge of a sprawling, ancient forest, it was quiet, almost forgotten. The roads were cracked, the houses old and worn, and the people, well, they were content with their small lives. Until now. Dr. Alice Harper had never heard of Brackenridge before the call came in. A cryptozoologist by trade, she'd spent her life chasing legends, creatures that skulked in the shadows of myth and reality. When she received the urgent request to investigate reports of a large black dog terrorizing the townsfolk, she assumed it was just another wild goose chase. But something about the voice on the other end of the line, quivering, desperate, convinced her to take the case. The drive into town was uneventful, the scenery blending into a monotonous blur of trees and mist. But as she neared Brackenridge, a sense of unease began to creep over her. The road narrowed, hemmed in by towering pines that seemed to swallow the daylight. The shadows stretched longer, darker, as if the forest itself was alive and watching. Alice arrived just before dusk. The town square was nearly empty, save for a few stragglers hurrying home. As she parked her car and stepped out, the air felt thick, oppressive, like the calm before a storm. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled with an instinctual warning. Something was wrong here. Her contact, Sheriff Ethan Graves, was waiting for her by the old stone fountain in the center of the square. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a face lined from years of worry. As she approached, he nodded in greeting, but there was no warmth in his eyes. "Dr. Harper," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Thank you for coming." Alice offered a thin smile. "You said you've been having trouble with a dog." The sheriff grimaced, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. "It's not just any dog, Doctor. This thing, it's not natural. It shows up without warning, and every time it does, someone in town dies. Heart attacks, accidents, even suicides. And they always say the same thing before they go, 'I saw it.'" Alice felt an icy sensation crawl down her back. What exactly did they see? Black. Big. Eyes like embers, Graves replied, his voice dropping even lower. "The old folks around here call it the Black Shuck. Say it's been around for centuries, an omen of death. But this isn't some fairy tale. Whatever it is, it's real. And it's here." Alice had heard of the Black Shuck before, a spectral hound from Old English folklore, said to haunt graveyards and lonely roads. But that was just a story, a ghost to scare children. Yet here, in the dying light of Brackenridge, with the sheriff's grave eyes boring into hers, the legend felt all too real. "Have you seen it?" she asked, her voice steady, though her heart beat faster in her chest. Graves hesitated, then nodded. "Last night, near the edge of the forest. I was on patrol when I caught a glimpse of it. It just stood there, watching me. I swear, Doctor, those eyes, they burned." Alice considered this, her mind racing. "Did you follow it?" "No," Graves said, shaking his head. "I've been a cop for 20 years, seen all kinds of things, but that thing was pure evil. I wasn't going to chase it into the woods." A silence fell between them, thick with unspoken fear. The sky above had darkened, and the first stars were beginning to peek through the twilight. The town seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. "Take me to where you saw it," Alice said finally, her voice firm. If there was something out there, she needed to see it for herself. The sheriff hesitated, then nodded again, his reluctance clear. "All right, but be careful, Doctor. This place, it's not like anywhere else." They set off towards the forest, a fading light casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. As they walked, the wind picked up, whispering through the trees like a mournful sigh. The path ahead seemed to close in on them, the branches intertwining above to form a dark, foreboding tunnel. Alice couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something ancient and malevolent was lurking just beyond the edge of sight. but she pushed the fear aside, focusing on the task at hand. This was just another case, another mystery to solve. Yet deep down, she knew this was different. There was something about Brackenridge, about the Black Shuck, that was unlike anything she'd ever encountered before. And as they neared the spot where the sheriff had seen the creature, Alice felt a strange, overwhelming certainty. Whatever this thing was, it was no ordinary animal. It was something much, much worse. They stopped at the edge of the forest, where the trees parted just enough to reveal a narrow, overgrown trail. Graves pointed ahead, his hand trembling slightly. It was right there, just standing in the middle of the path, like it was waiting for me. Alice peered into the darkness, but saw nothing. Just the shadows of the trees, swaying in the breeze. But the air was thick with tension, the kind that made your skin crawl, that made you want to turn and run. She took a step forward, her heart pounding in her ears. And then she saw it, a flash of red, like two burning coals, deep within the forest. The eyes. They were watching her, just as they had watched Graves. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure of the Black Shuck slowly materialized from the shadows. It was massive, larger than any dog she had ever seen, its fur as dark as the void, its eyes glowing with a malevolent fire. For a moment, time stood still. The world narrowed to just Alice and the creature, locked in a silent, terrifying gaze. She felt its power, its ancient, malevolent energy, radiating through the darkness. This was no animal. This was something far older, something that should not exist. And then, as quickly as it appeared, the Black Shuck vanished, melting back into the shadows like smoke. The forest was silent again, but the weight of what she had seen lingered in the air, pressing down on her chest. Alice stood frozen, her mind racing. This was real. The Black Shuck was real, and it was only the beginning. Dr. Graves' voice was distant, muffled by the pounding of her heart. "Did you see it?" Alice nodded slowly, her eyes still fixed on the spot where the creature had disappeared. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I saw it." As they turned to leave, the wind picked up once more, carrying with it a low, mournful howl that echoed through the trees. Alice shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her. She had come to Brackenridge expecting to debunk a myth. Instead, she had stumbled upon something far more terrifying. The omen had been seen. And she knew, deep in her bones, that death was coming. The night in Brackenridge was heavy, the air thick with a damp chill that clung to the skin. Dr. Alice Harper sat in the small, dimly lit room of the town's only inn, the flickering light from the bedside lamp casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. She stared at the open journal in front of her. The pages blank, her pen hovering uselessly above the paper. She couldn't shake the image of those eyes, burning, watching. The Black Shuck. It had been real. She had seen it with her own eyes, and the memory gnawed at her like a festering wound. The stories, the legends, none of them had prepared her for the sheer malevolence she had felt radiating from the creature. It was no ordinary beast. It was something far more sinister, something ancient and full of dark purpose. She had come to Brackenridge expecting to find an explanation, something grounded in reality, a misidentified animal, perhaps, or a case of mass hysteria. But now, after seeing the creature herself, she was beginning to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. A soft knock on the door broke her from her thoughts. She looked up, heart pounding, and called out, "Come in." The door creaked open, and Sheriff Graves stepped inside. His face was pale, and his eyes, usually so stern, were shadowed with worry. He had the look of a man who had seen too much and had no way of making sense of it. "Doctor," he said quietly, closing the door behind him, "I need to know what you saw tonight. Did you get a good look at it?" Alice hesitated, the memory of those glowing eyes still vivid in her mind. "Yes," she finally replied. "I saw it. And it's exactly as you described. Big, black, And those eyes. They were like embers, burning in the dark. Graves nodded, his expression grim. That's it, all right. The Black Shuck. It's been haunting this town for generations, and every time it appears, someone dies. I was hoping you might have a different explanation, but he trailed off, rubbing a hand over his face. This isn't something that can be explained, is it? Alice shook her head slowly. No, it's not. Whatever that thing is, it's not something I've ever encountered before. It's unnatural. The sheriff sighed, sinking into the chair across from her. Then what do we do? How do we stop it? Alice wished she had an answer. She was used to dealing with the unknown, with creatures and phenomena that defied explanation, but this was different. There was something about the Black Shuck that felt ancient, powerful, and beyond anything she had ever faced. The thought of trying to stop it filled her with a deep, instinctual dread. I don't know, she admitted. But I need to learn more about it. I need to understand what we're dealing with before we can figure out how to fight it. Graves nodded, though his eyes remained dark with doubt. You might not have much time. The Black Shuck isn't just an omen. It's a hunter. And now that you've seen it, Doctor, it might be coming for you. Alice's stomach twisted at his words, but she forced herself to remain calm. Then I'll just have to stay ahead of it, won't I? The sheriff didn't respond, his silence heavy with unspoken fears. He stood after a moment, his movements slow and weary. I'll leave you to it then. Just be careful, Doctor. Brackenridge has already lost too many to that thing. Alice watched as he left, the door closing softly behind him. The room felt colder, emptier without his presence, and the shadows seemed to stretch further into the corners, as if something was lurking just out of sight. She turned her attention back to her journal, finally putting pen to paper. She needed to document everything, to record her thoughts and observations while they were still fresh. It was the only way to make sense of the chaos in her mind. But as she wrote, the feeling of being watched crept over her again, the same sensation she had felt in the forest. It was as if those burning eyes were still fixed on her, peering through the walls, the darkness itself bending to the will of the creature. She paused, listening. The inn was quiet, the only sound the faint rustling of the wind outside. But there was something else, something just on the edge of hearing, a low, almost imperceptible growl, deep and menacing. Alice's heart raced as she looked around the room, her breath quickening. The shadows seemed to shift, to move on their own, and the growl grew louder, more insistent, as if it was coming from right behind her. She spun around, her eyes wide, but the room was empty. The growl stopped, leaving only the silence and the pounding of her heart in her ears. It was then that she saw it, a fleeting glimpse in the mirror above the dresser. The reflection of a massive black shape standing just behind her, its eyes glowing with that same terrifying red. But when she turned to face it, there was nothing there, just the empty room, quiet and still. Alice's hands trembled as she reached for the mirror, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The glass was cold, unyielding, and her own pale reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed and frightened. But she knew what she had seen. The Black Shuck had been there, watching her, just as it had watched Graves in the forest. It was toying with her, testing her resolve, and it wasn't going to stop until it had claimed another victim. She sat down on the edge of the bed, her mind racing. The creature was real, and it was closer than she had thought. She needed to figure out how to stop it before it was too late. But as the night dragged on, and the darkness deepened outside the window, Alice couldn't shake the feeling that the Black Shuck was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. And this time she feared it wouldn't just be a glimpse. The next morning the sky was a dull, overcast gray, casting a bleak light over Brackenridge. Dr. Alice Harper sat at a small table in the inn's common room, surrounded by books and notes. Her laptop hummed quietly as she scrolled through pages of research, her eyes scanning the text with focused intensity. She had barely slept the night before. The image of the Black Shuck, those burning eyes, that massive, shadowy form had haunted her dreams, leaving her restless and anxious. But fear wasn't going to stop her. She had a job to do, and the first step was understanding exactly what she was dealing with. The Black Shuck wasn't just a local legend. Similar stories of spectral black dogs existed all over the world: Britain, Ireland, Germany, even parts of North America. In every account, the creature was seen as a harbinger of death, an omen that foretold disaster. But what troubled Alice the most was that in each of these stories, the appearance of the Black Shuck wasn't just a warning, it was a promise of death. She found an old case from the 1800s in East Anglia, England, where a village had been terrorized by sightings of a black dog. Within a year, the village was decimated by a mysterious illness, and those who had seen the creature were among the first to die. Another case from the 1950s in Maine described a similar event, where a black dog was seen in the days leading up to a devastating fire that claimed the lives of several townspeople. Each story was different, yet eerily similar. The Black Shuck would appear, watching, waiting, and soon after, death would follow. It was as if the creature was marking its victims, sealing their fate with a single, burning glance. Alice's fingers drummed on the table as she stared at the screen, trying to piece together the fragments of information. There was no clear explanation for the Black Shuck's existence. Some believed it was a spirit, a manifestation of death itself. Others thought it was a demon, a creature from another realm that had somehow crossed into ours. But none of these theories provided a way to stop it. She leaned back in her chair, frustration gnawing at her. The more she learned, the more hopeless the situation seemed. How could she fight something that had been haunting humanity for centuries? Something that, by all accounts, was unstoppable? Her eyes fell on a small, leather-bound book she had found in the town's dusty old library earlier that morning. It was a collection of local folklore, and within it, she had discovered a few references to the Black Shuck. But one passage, in particular, stood out. "The beast with eyes of fire shall mark the soul, and within a year's turn that soul shall be claimed. None who see it may escape their fate, save for the one who carries the mark of protection, given by the old ways, forgotten by most." Alice frowned, reading the passage again. The mark of protection, what was that? Could it be a way to ward off the Black Shuck, to protect those who had seen it? The text offered no further explanation, but it was the first hint of a possible solution she had found. It was a slim hope, but it was better than nothing. She decided to dig deeper into the old ways, the ancient rituals that might hold the key to stopping the creature. But as she began her search, a gnawing thought tugged at the back of her mind. What if the Black Shuck wasn't just an omen? What if it was more than just a passive observer? What if it actively chose its victims, marking them not just for death, but for something far worse? Her research led her into the darker corners of folklore, where stories of the Black Shuck took on a more sinister tone. In some versions, the creature wasn't just a harbinger of death, it was a collector of souls, a being that fed on the fear and despair of those it marked. The more Alice read, the clearer it became this wasn't just a supernatural dog roaming the countryside. It was a predator, ancient and malevolent, with a purpose beyond simple terror. The thought made her shiver, but she pressed on, determined to find a way to protect herself and the townsfolk. Hours passed as she pored over texts, her eyes growing tired, but her mind racing. She found references to symbols, charms, and incantations, all supposedly used to ward off evil spirits. But they were vague, their meanings lost to time, and none specifically mentioned the Black Shuck. The afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the room. Alice rubbed her eyes, exhausted but unwilling to stop. There had to be something here, something that could help. She reached for another book, but her hand froze halfway, the air around her suddenly feeling colder, heavier. A low growl rumbled through the room, barely audible but unmistakable. Her heart skipped a beat, and she slowly turned her head toward the window. Outside, the sky had darkened, and the trees swayed in the growing wind. But there, just at the edge of the forest, she saw it, a pair of glowing red eyes watching her from the shadows. The Black Shuck had found her. She stared back, her breath caught in her throat. The creature didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence filled the room, thick with a malevolent energy. It was as if the air itself was pressing down on her, crushing her with the weight of its gaze. Alice forced herself to breathe, to stay calm. It wasn't attacking, not yet. It was waiting, as it always did, biding its time. But she knew that time was running out. The stories were clear. Once you saw the Black Shuck, death was inevitable. But she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. She reached for her notebook, her hand shaking slightly, and began to sketch the symbols she had found in her research. If there was any chance that these ancient marks could protect her, she had to try. The creature outside the window continued to watch, its eyes burning into her, but she refused to look away from her work. She couldn't afford to lose focus now. The room grew darker, the shadows lengthening as night fell. But Alice didn't stop, her pen moving faster, her mind racing. She had to finish before the creature decided to make its move. She had to be ready. And as she drew the final symbol, a sense of resolve settled over her. She didn't know if this would work, but it was all she had. The Black Shuck might be powerful, ancient, and terrifying, but Alice Harper wasn't going down without a fight. She looked up at the window one last time. The eyes were still there, watching, waiting. But this time, she didn't feel the same overwhelming dread. Instead, she felt a flicker of hope, a small but determined spark in the darkness. The creature was real, and it was deadly. But Alice was ready. The battle had just begun. The next day dawned with an unsettling stillness. The sun was a weak, pale disk hidden behind thick clouds, and the air felt heavy, almost oppressive. Dr. Alice Harper awoke with a sense of dread, the memory of those burning eyes still fresh in her mind. She had spent the night surrounded by her hastily drawn symbols, hoping they would offer some protection. But the fear that had gnawed at her all night hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had grown stronger. The inn was eerily quiet as she made her way downstairs. The usual hum of morning activity was absent, replaced by a tense, uneasy silence. Alice felt it as soon as she stepped into the common room, a palpable weight hanging in the air, as if the building itself was holding its breath. She found Sheriff Graves waiting for her by the front door, his face grim. His eyes, usually sharp and attentive, were clouded with worry. "We've had another death," he said without preamble, his voice low. Alice's heart sank. "Who?" "Henry Thompson," Graves replied, the name heavy on his tongue. "He was one of the men who saw the Black Shuck with me that night. They found him early this morning, out by the old mill. Looked like a heart attack." Alice swallowed hard. She had known this was coming. She had read enough about the Black Shuck to understand its pattern, but that didn't make it any easier. Henry Thompson had been marked, and now he was gone. "Take me to him," she said, steeling herself for what she knew would be a grim sight. Graves nodded, leading her out into the gray morning. The town was quiet, the usual sounds of daily life muted by the news of yet another death. As they walked, Alice couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the eyes of the Black Shuck were still on her, hidden somewhere in the shadows. The old mill was at the edge of town, a crumbling relic of Brackenridge's past. It stood alone, surrounded by overgrown grass and thick, tangled trees. The air around it was colder, the silence more oppressive. As they approached, Alice saw a small group of townspeople gathered near the entrance, their faces pale and drawn. They parted silently as Graves and Alice walked up, their eyes filled with fear and resignation. Henry Thompson's body lay on the ground, sprawled out as if he had simply collapsed where he stood. His skin was ashen, his eyes wide open in a frozen expression of terror. Alice knelt beside him, her breath catching in her throat. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of violence, yet the fear on his face was unmistakable. It was as if he had seen something so horrifying that his heart had simply stopped. He was healthy, Graves said quietly, standing beside her. No history of heart problems. I checked. This shouldn't have happened. Alice nodded, her eyes still on Henry's lifeless form. It's the Black Shuck, she murmured. It marks its victims, and then it takes them. Sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. But once you've seen it, your fate is sealed. Graves sighed, the sound filled with frustration and helplessness. And there's nothing we can do to stop it. Alice hesitated, remembering the symbols she had drawn, the rituals she had read about. She wasn't sure if they would work, but she couldn't let the sheriff believe there was no hope. Not yet. I'm working on it, she said, trying to inject some confidence into her voice. There might be a way to protect ourselves. I need more time. Graves looked at her, his eyes searching for any sign of reassurance. Finally he nodded, though the doubt remained etched in his expression. We'll keep this quiet, he said, glancing at the gathering townspeople. No need to stir up more fear than we already have. But the people here, they know what's happening. They've seen it before. Alice stood up, her mind racing. She needed to figure out what to do next. The Black Shuck was real, and it was deadly. But there had to be something she could do to break the cycle, to stop it before it claimed another life. As she turned to leave, her gaze fell on Henry's lifeless eyes once more. A shiver ran down her spine. The Black Shuck wasn't just an omen, it was a killer. And now that she had seen it, she knew it wouldn't stop until it had claimed her, too. She needed to move quickly, to uncover the truth before it was too late. The clock was ticking, and with each passing moment, the shadow of the Black Shuck loomed larger over Brackenridge. But as she walked away from the mill, Alice couldn't shake the feeling that she was already too late. The sky over Brackenridge was a cold, lifeless gray, as if the sun had abandoned the town. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a sense of unease. Dr. Alice Harper stood at the edge of the forest, her heart pounding in her chest. Sheriff Graves and a handful of townsfolk stood beside her, each of them clutching flashlights and weapons, a shotgun, an old hunting rifle, and a few heavy sticks. Their faces were set in grim determination, but Alice could see the fear in their eyes. We have to find it, Graves said, his voice firm but low. If we don't, more people will die. We need to end this now. Alice nodded, though her stomach churned with anxiety. The idea of hunting the Black Shuck, a creature that had terrified her since she first laid eyes on it, seemed almost suicidal. But what choice did they have? The beast was real, and it had already claimed a life. If they didn't confront it, it would continue its deadly game. The group moved into the forest, the dense canopy above swallowing what little light remained. The trees stood tall and close, their branches intertwining to form a dark tunnel that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. The path beneath their feet was narrow and uneven, covered in a thick carpet of leaves and undergrowth. Every sound, a snapping twig, the rustle of leaves, seemed amplified, echoing through the silent woods. Alice kept her flashlight trained on the ground in front of her, each step taken with cautious precision. The light flickered occasionally, the batteries struggling to keep up, but she didn't dare turn it off. The darkness in these woods felt alive, as if it was waiting to swallow them whole. The tension was palpable, each person's breath shallow and quick. No one spoke, the silence too fragile to break. They all knew what they were looking for, and none of them wanted to be the first to see it. They walked for what felt like hours, the forest growing denser, the path narrower. The further they went, the more it felt like the woods were closing in around them, the trees leaning in closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The air grew colder, the wind biting at their skin. Then, just as Alice began to wonder if they were chasing shadows, Graves raised his hand, signaling for them to stop. They froze, every muscle tensed, ears straining for any sound that might give away the creature's presence. And then they heard it, a low, deep growl, rolling through the trees like distant thunder. It was a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating in Alice's bones. She felt her breath catch in her throat, her heart pounding like a drum. "There," Graves whispered, pointing ahead into the darkness. Alice followed his gaze, her flashlight sweeping across the trees. At first she saw nothing, just the dense tangle of branches and shadows. But then, in the distance, she caught a glimpse of movement, a flash of black fur, a pair of glowing red eyes. The Black Shuck was watching them. "Stay together," Graves ordered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't let it separate us." The group tightened their formation, weapons raised, as they moved slowly forward. The creature didn't move, its eyes locked onto them, unblinking and full of malice. It was as if it was daring them to come closer, taunting them with its presence. Alice's hands were slick with sweat, her flashlight trembling slightly. She had faced dangerous animals before, even predators, but nothing like this. This was no ordinary beast. This was something ancient, something evil. The Black Shuck let out another growl, louder this time, and took a step forward. The group stopped in their tracks, fear rippling through them. The creature was massive, its body shrouded in shadow, but its eyes burned with a light that seemed to cut through the darkness. It was close now, close enough that they could see the faint outline of its fur, the way it seemed to blend into the night, becoming one with the shadows. "Shoot it," someone whispered, their voice trembling with fear. Graves hesitated, his finger hovering over the trigger of his shotgun. But before he could make a decision, the Black Shuck moved. It was fast, impossibly fast, darting through the trees with a speed that left them all reeling. One moment it was in front of them, and the next it was gone, disappearing into the depths of the forest. After it, Graves barked, his voice breaking the spell. They plunged forward, chasing the creature through the trees, but the forest seemed to conspire against them. The path twisted and turned, the undergrowth tripping them up, branches snagging their clothes and cutting at their skin. The darkness deepened, the light from their flashlights barely penetrating the thick gloom. Alice's heart raced as she struggled to keep up, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The Black Shuck was leading them deeper into the woods, into a part of the forest that felt wrong, ancient, as if it had been untouched by time. The trees here were larger, their trunks twisted and gnarled, their branches heavy with moss. The air was colder, almost freezing, and there was a smell earthy, damp, and rotten. The growl came again, louder, closer, and Alice realized with a jolt of fear that the creature was circling them. It was no longer running, it was hunting. "Stay close," Graves shouted, his voice laced with panic. "Don't let it pick us off." But the group was already starting to fragment, the fear driving them to desperation. One of the men, his face pale with terror, broke away, running blindly into the woods. Graves called after him, but it was too late. The man was swallowed by the darkness, his footsteps fading into the distance. Then, without warning, the Black Shuck attacked. It came out of the shadows like a nightmare, its eyes blazing, its jaws wide open. It struck with terrifying speed, knocking another man to the ground with a single brutal swipe of its claws. The man screamed, but the sound was cut off as the creature's jaws closed around his throat. Alice stumbled back, her mind frozen with horror. Graves fired his shotgun, the blast echoing through the trees, but the creature barely flinched. It turned to face them, its muzzle dripping with blood, its eyes burning with an unholy light. "Run," Alice shouted, her voice breaking through the paralysis. They scattered, the group breaking apart in their panic, fleeing into the forest. Alice ran blindly, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in sharp, painful gasps. The trees blurred around her, the shadows twisting and writhing like living things. She could hear the Black Shuck behind her, its growl vibrating through the air, closer and closer. She stumbled, her foot catching on a root, and fell hard to the ground. Pain shot through her leg, but she forced herself up, adrenaline propelling her forward. The creature was right behind her. She could feel it, hear its breath, smell the blood on its fur. She burst through a dense thicket, the branches tearing at her clothes, and found herself in a small clearing. The sky above was dark, the stars hidden by thick clouds. She turned, her heart hammering, and saw the Black Shuck standing at the edge of the trees, its eyes fixed on her. For a moment, everything was still. The creature didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching her, as if deciding whether to strike. Alice's breath caught in her throat, her entire body trembling with fear. But then, slowly, the Black Shuck turned and disappeared into the forest, melting back into the shadows as if it had never been there. Alice collapsed to her knees, her body shaking uncontrollably. The hunt was over, but the terror lingered, wrapping around her like a cold, suffocating fog. They hadn't found the Black Shuck. It had found them. And it wasn't done with them yet. The forest was silent, unnaturally so. Dr. Alice Harper could hear nothing but the sound of her own ragged breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath her feet as she stumbled through the darkness. The trees seemed to close in around her, their twisted branches reaching out like fingers, pulling her deeper into the heart of the woods. She had lost the others. In the panic and confusion, they had scattered, each one fleeing in a different direction, trying to escape the terror that hunted them. Alice had no idea where she was or how far she had run. The forest had become a labyrinth, a never-ending maze of shadows and silence. But it wasn't just the silence that unnerved her. It was the whispers. At first she thought it was the wind rustling through the leaves, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. But as she moved deeper into the woods, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. It was like a chorus of voices, murmuring just out of reach, too low to understand but impossible to ignore. Alice stopped, her heart pounding in her chest, and strained to listen. The whispers seemed to be all around her, coming from the trees, the ground, even the air itself. They weren't human. They were something else, something older, something that had been here long before Brackenridge existed. The fear that had been gnawing at her since she first saw the Black Shuck now tightened its grip on her heart. She was alone, lost in a forest that seemed alive with malevolent intent. The trees themselves felt as if they were watching her, judging her every move. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" The whispers answered her, rising in pitch, but still too faint to make out. It was as if they were speaking a language she couldn't understand, a language that was not meant for human ears. Alice's breath quickened. She needed to find her way out of here, back to the town, back to safety. But every direction looked the same, a sea of dark trees and tangled undergrowth. She turned in circles, trying to remember which way she had come, but it was hopeless. The forest had swallowed her. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw something move. A flicker of shadow, just at the edge of her vision. She whipped her head around, but there was nothing there. Just trees and darkness. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if urging her to follow, to go deeper into the woods. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, to run, but something pulled at her, a strange compulsion that she couldn't resist. She took a step forward, then another, her feet moving of their own accord. The ground beneath her was soft, spongy, as if it had been disturbed recently. The air grew colder, carrying a damp, earthy smell that made her stomach turn. The whispers continued, a constant murmur in her ears, guiding her forward. She didn't know where they were leading her, but she couldn't stop herself. It was as if she was being drawn towards something hidden deep within the forest. She pushed through a dense thicket, the branches scratching at her skin, and stumbled into a small clearing. The trees here were ancient, their trunks thick and gnarled, their roots twisting through the ground like serpents. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the whispers reached a fever pitch, swirling around her like a storm. In the center of the clearing stood an old stone well, its edges crumbling with age. The well was dry, its mouth yawning open like a black hole, a void that seemed to stretch down into the very heart of the earth. Alice approached the well, her body trembling with a fear that she couldn't explain. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if urging her to look inside. She peered over the edge, her breath catching in her throat. At first she saw nothing but darkness, but as her eyes adjusted, she noticed something moving deep within the well, something shifting in the shadows. She leaned closer, squinting into the blackness, trying to make out what it was. Then, suddenly the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, oppressive, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Alice felt goosebumps form along her back, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She knew instinctively that something was terribly wrong. A sound echoed up from the depths of the well, a low, guttural growl, vibrating through the stone, through the ground, through her bones. It was a sound that she recognized, a sound that filled her with a primal, overwhelming terror. The Black Shuck. Alice stumbled back, her heart racing, as the growl grew louder, more menacing. The darkness within the well seemed to pulse, to writhe, as if something was trying to claw its way out. She could feel its presence, its malevolent energy, rising up from the depths, ready to consume her. She turned and ran, crashing through the undergrowth, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers returned, but now they were different, urgent, panicked, as if warning her to flee. She didn't need to be told twice. The forest blurred around her, the trees merging into a dark, twisting tunnel. The growl followed her, growing louder, closer, until it was all she could hear. It was as if the Black Shuck was right behind her, its breath hot on her neck, its eyes burning into her back. Alice ran faster, her lungs burning, her legs screaming in pain. She didn't know where she was going, didn't care. All she knew was that she had to get away, had to escape the terror that hunted her. And then, just when she thought she couldn't run any further, she burst out of the forest and into the open. The sudden light blinded her, and she stumbled, falling to her knees in the grass. The growl stopped, the whispers silenced, leaving only the sound of her own ragged breathing. She looked up, blinking against the light, and realized she was at the edge of the forest, back near the town. The trees loomed behind her, dark and foreboding. But the sense of malevolence was gone, replaced by a cold, empty silence. Alice struggled to her feet, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She had escaped the forest, but she knew the danger wasn't over. The Black Shuck was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next move. And the whispers. They had been trying to tell her something, to warn her. But of what? She didn't know, and that terrified her more than anything. The forest, the whispers, the well, there was something dark, something ancient and evil, hidden within Brackenridge, and the Black Shuck was only the beginning. As she stood there, staring into the depths of the forest, Alice knew one thing for certain: the hunt wasn't over. It had only just begun. The next morning, Brackenridge was wrapped in a thick, ghostly fog. The streets were empty, the houses silent, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Dr. Alice Harper felt the cold seep into her bones as she walked through the deserted streets, her breath forming small clouds in the air. She hadn't slept after the terror of the previous night, and the exhaustion weighed heavily on her. But there was something she needed to do. Something that had been nagging at the back of her mind since she had fled from the forest. The whispers, the well, the presence of the Black Shuck, it all pointed to something deeper, something older than she had first thought. And she had a feeling that someone in the town knew more than they were letting on. She made her way to the edge of town, where the houses gave way to the thick woods. There, at the very edge of civilization, stood a small, dilapidated cabin. It was half hidden by overgrown bushes and tangled vines, as if the forest was trying to reclaim it. The windows were dark, the door slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. Alice had heard whispers in town about the old man who lived here. He was a recluse, a man who had been around longer than anyone could remember. Some said he was mad, others said he was wise, but everyone agreed on one thing: he knew things that no one else did. She approached the cabin cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The air here felt different, heavier, more oppressive. It was as if the weight of centuries hung over the place, the very ground steeped in forgotten memories. Alice knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the empty cabin. For a long moment, there was no answer, only the soft rustling of the trees and the distant call of a crow. She was about to turn away when she heard the shuffling of feet from inside, slow and deliberate. The door creaked open, and a figure appeared in the shadows. The old man was bent and frail, his back hunched, his face a map of deep wrinkles. His eyes, though cloudy with age, held a sharpness that made Alice hesitate. There was something in his gaze, something that spoke of knowledge far beyond what was normal. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice rough, like dry leaves scraping against stone. Alice swallowed, gathering her courage. "I need your help," she said. "I've seen the Black Shuck." The old man's eyes narrowed, and he let out a low, rumbling sound that might have been a laugh. "You're not the first," he said, turning and shuffling back into the cabin. "Come in, if you dare." Alice hesitated for only a moment before following him inside. The cabin was dark, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and old earth. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with dusty books, jars of strange substances, and odd trinkets that she couldn't begin to identify. A fire crackled weakly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. The old man moved to a chair by the fire and sank into it with a groan. He gestured for Alice to sit in the chair opposite him, and she did, trying to ignore the way the shadows seemed to dance just out of the corner of her eye. "So, you've seen the Shuck," the old man said, his voice slow and deliberate. "That means you're marked, and if you're marked, there's not much hope for you." Alice felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "I know the story," she said, "but I need to know more. What is it? Why is it here?" The old man stared into the fire, his eyes distant, as if he was looking back through time. "The Black Shuck is no ordinary beast," he said after a long silence. "It's older than this town, older than the forest. It's a guardian, a protector of something buried deep in the earth. Something that should never be disturbed." Alice leaned forward, her heart racing. "The well," she whispered. "Is that what it's protecting?" The old man's gaze snapped to hers, his eyes sharp and piercing. "You found it, then," he said. "The well is the key. It's a gateway, a door to a place that was sealed long ago. The Shuck was placed here to guard it, to keep it closed. But something's changed. The door is weakening, and the Shuck, it's trying to keep the darkness from spilling out." Alice's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of information. The whispers. I heard whispers in the forest. They were trying to warn me. The old man nodded slowly. "The forest remembers. The trees, the earth, they've seen it all. They know what's buried there, and they know the danger. The whispers are the voices of the past, warning you to stay away." "But how do we stop it?" Alice asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "How do we stop the Black Shuck or whatever it's protecting?" The old man sighed, a sound filled with the weight of centuries. "You can't stop it," he said, his voice heavy with finality. The shuck isn't the enemy. It's the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. If it fails, if that door opens, there'll be no stopping what comes through. A cold chill ran down Alice's spine. She had thought the Black Shuck was the threat, but now she realized it was something far worse. Something ancient, something that should never be allowed to escape. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The old man looked at her with those sharp, knowing eyes. "You stay away from the well," he said. "You leave this town and never look back. That's the only way to survive." Alice knew that he was right, but she also knew she couldn't just leave. Not when people were dying, not when the Black Shuck was still out there, fighting to protect a secret that could destroy them all. "I can't do that," she said, her voice firm. "I have to try to stop it." The old man sighed again, shaking his head. "Then you're a fool," he said, "but a brave one. Just remember this. If you go back to that well, you may not come back." Alice stood, her resolve hardening. "Thank you," she said, though she knew there was little comfort in his words. As she turned to leave, the old man spoke again, his voice softer, almost gentle. "May the shuck protect you, Doctor," he said, "because once you step into those woods again, it's the only thing that can." Alice left the cabin, the weight of his words heavy on her shoulders. The fog had lifted slightly, but the sky was still gray, the town still silent. She looked back at the forest, the dark trees standing like sentinels, guarding the secrets buried within. She knew what she had to do. She had to go back, had to find a way to stop whatever was trying to break free. But as she walked toward the edge of the woods, she couldn't shake the feeling that the old man's warning was more than just a caution. It was a prophecy, and she feared it would come true. The forest was darker than before, as if the sun had forgotten to rise. Dr. Alice Harper stood at the edge, staring into the tangled mass of trees that seemed to swallow all light and hope. The old man's words echoed in her mind, warning her to stay away, to leave Brackenridge and never look back. But she couldn't. Not with the Black Shuck still out there, fighting to protect something that should never be unleashed. She took a deep breath, clutching the leather-bound book she had found in the town's library, the one that had led her here. It was old, its pages yellowed and brittle, filled with strange symbols and cryptic passages. But among them she had found a ritual, one that might be able to bind the Black Shuck and keep the gateway sealed. It was a long shot, but it was all she had. The forest seemed to close in around her as she stepped into the shadows, the trees looming tall and menacing. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and every sound, every sap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made her heart jump. She kept her flashlight pointed ahead, its weak beam cutting through the darkness, but it felt like the light was being swallowed by the shadows. As she walked deeper into the forest, the whispers returned. They were faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but they grew louder with every step, filling the air with a chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. They weren't the same as before. These whispers were different, more insistent, almost pleading. Alice forced herself to ignore them, focusing on the path ahead. She knew where she needed to go, back to the well, the place where it had all started, the place where the Black Shuck had first appeared to her. She wasn't sure what she would find when she got there, but she knew it was the only way to end this. The forest thickened around her, the trees growing closer together, their branches intertwining above her head, blocking out the sky. The ground beneath her feet was soft and uneven, the undergrowth thick with brambles that snagged at her clothes. She had to push her way through, each step a struggle against the encroaching darkness. Finally, after what felt like hours, she reached the clearing. The well stood in the center, its stone edges crumbling and worn with age. The air was cold here, colder than anywhere else in the forest, and the whispers were louder, more frantic, as if they were trying to warn her away. Alice approached the well cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The darkness within the well seemed deeper than before, a void that swallowed all light. She could feel the malevolent energy radiating from it, a cold, suffocating presence that made her skin crawl. She took a deep breath, opened the book, and began to read the ritual aloud. The words were strange, unfamiliar, but they rolled off her tongue with a strange ease, as if she had spoken them before. As she read, the air around her seemed to shift, the whispers growing louder, more frantic, but she forced herself to keep going, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. The wind picked up, swirling around her, carrying the whispers with it. The trees swayed, their branches creaking and groaning, as if they were alive, as if they were trying to pull her away from the well. But Alice held her ground, her voice rising above the wind, above the whispers, as she chanted the final words of the ritual. And then, as the last word left her lips, the wind stopped. The forest fell silent, the whispers gone, the air heavy with anticipation. Alice felt a cold sweat break out on her skin, her heart hammering in her chest. She stared at the well, waiting, her breath caught in her throat. For a moment nothing happened. The forest was still, the darkness oppressive. But then, from deep within the well, she heard a sound, a low, rumbling growl, vibrating through the stone, through the ground, through her very bones. The Black Shuck. The growl grew louder, more menacing, as if the creature was clawing its way up from the depths. The darkness within the well seemed to pulse, to expand, as if something was trying to break free. Alice took a step back, her heart racing with fear. The ritual wasn't working. If anything, it was making things worse. She turned to run, but it was too late. The Black Shuck burst from the well, its massive form towering over her, its eyes blazing with a fiery light. It was larger than before, more terrifying, its fur as dark as the void, its jaws wide open in a snarl that sent a jolt of terror through her. Alice froze, her mind screaming at her to run, but her body refused to move. The creature's gaze locked onto hers, its eyes burning with a hatred that was almost palpable. She could feel its power, its ancient, malevolent energy, radiating from it, filling the air with a suffocating presence. And then, to her horror, the Black Shuck spoke. Its voice was deep, guttural, like the sound of rocks grinding together, and it filled the clearing with a terrible, echoing resonance. "You dare to bind me," it growled, its voice filled with a fury that shook the very ground. "You cannot stop what is coming. The gate will open, and all will be consumed." Alice felt a cold dread wash over her. The creature wasn't just a guardian, it was a harbinger, a servant of something far darker, far more powerful. The ritual hadn't just failed, it had awakened something that should never have been disturbed. She turned and ran, her feet slipping on the damp ground, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The Black Shuck's growl echoed behind her, growing louder, closer, as it gave chase. She could feel it gaining on her, its breath hot on her neck, its eyes burning into her back. But just as she thought she was done for, she heard a sound, a faint, distant howl, cutting through the darkness like a knife. It wasn't the Black Shuck's growl, it was something else, something that made the creature hesitate, if only for a moment. That moment was enough. Alice burst through the trees, back into the town, her lungs burning, her legs trembling with exhaustion. She didn't stop running until she was back in the center of Brackenridge, where the few remaining lights flickered weakly in the fog. She collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, her body shaking with fear and exhaustion. The Black Shuck hadn't followed her, but she knew it wasn't over. The ritual had failed, and whatever was buried beneath the well was waking up. As she lay there, staring up at the gray, featureless sky, Alice knew one thing for certain: the darkness was coming, and there was no stopping it. The Black Shuck had been right. The gate would open, and Brackenridge would be consumed. But she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. She still had one last chance, one last desperate hope. She just didn't know what it was yet. The air in Brackenridge was thick, almost suffocating, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on the town. The sun remained hidden behind a dense blanket of clouds, casting everything in a dim, gray light that felt more like dusk than morning. Dr. Alice Harper stood in the town square, staring back toward the forest, her heart heavy with the weight of failure. The ritual hadn't worked. If anything, it had made things worse. She had seen the Black Shuck rise from the well, its eyes burning with a fury that seemed to shake the very ground. She had heard its terrible voice, promising doom, and she knew now that the creature wasn't just a guardian. It was something much more dangerous, something that had been unleashed because of her. She needed to find Sheriff Graves, to warn him, to figure out what to do next. But as she turned to head toward the sheriff's office, she noticed something strange. The townspeople, what few were left, were all outside, standing in small, nervous groups, their faces pale and drawn. They were all looking in the same direction toward the forest. Alice's stomach twisted with dread. She knew instinctively that something had changed, that something was happening. She started to walk toward the sheriff's office, but stopped when she saw Graves himself coming out, his face as grim as she'd ever seen it. "Doctor," he said, his voice tight with tension, "you need to see this." Alice followed him without a word, her heart pounding in her chest. They walked quickly through the streets, the uneasy silence of the town hanging over them like a shroud. As they neared the edge of the forest, Alice noticed that the trees seemed darker, more twisted, their branches heavy with a strange, oily mist that clung to the ground. Graves led her to a small hill overlooking the forest. From there she could see it all, an expanse of trees, all shrouded in that same dark mist, stretching out toward the horizon. But what caught her eye, what made her breath catch in her throat, was the movement within the mist. The forest was alive with shadows, shifting and swirling like a storm. The trees themselves seemed to writhe, their branches twisting and curling as if in pain. And there, at the very center of the forest, rising up from the earth like a terrible monument, was the well. The stone was no longer crumbling, it was whole, and from its depths came a pulsing, dark light that seemed to taint the very air around it. Alice felt a cold dread settle in her bones. The well was no longer just a hole in the ground, it was something else entirely. It was as if it had become a living thing, a portal to something far darker than she had imagined. "It's waking up," Graves said quietly, his voice filled with a kind of resigned terror. "The Black Shuck. It wasn't just protecting that well. It was keeping whatever's inside it from getting out." Alice stared at the well, at the dark light pulsing from its depths, and felt a shiver run down her spine. "We need to stop it," she said, her voice shaking, "before it's too late." Graves turned to her, his eyes hollow. "How? The ritual didn't work, and now it's stronger. What can we do against that?" Alice didn't have an answer. She had spent her life chasing legends, studying creatures that existed on the edge of reality. But this was beyond anything she had ever encountered. This wasn't just a creature or a spirit. This was something primordial, something that had been locked away for a reason. She watched as the mist began to spread, creeping out from the forest and toward the town. The shadows within it grew darker, more defined, and she could hear something, distant, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, the sound of voices, hundreds of them, all whispering in unison. "The whispers," she murmured, remembering the voices she had heard in the forest, the ones that had tried to warn her. "They're coming from the well." Graves nodded, his face pale. "And they're getting louder." Alice clenched her fists, her mind racing. There had to be something she could do, some way to stop this before it consumed the town, before it spread beyond Brackenridge. But the more she thought, the more hopeless it seemed. The Black Shuck had been their only defense, and now it was gone, or worse. It had become part of the very darkness it was meant to keep at bay. "We need to get everyone out of here," Graves said suddenly, his voice filled with urgency. "If that mist reaches the town." He didn't need to finish. Alice knew what he meant. The mist was more than just a sign of the awakening. It was a harbinger of what was to come. And if it reached the town, there would be no stopping it. They turned and ran back toward the town square, their footsteps echoing eerily in the stillness. The townspeople watched them as they approached, their faces filled with confusion and fear. "Listen to me," Graves shouted, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "We need to leave. Now. Everyone, pack your things and get out of town." There was a moment of stunned silence, and then the crowd erupted in a chorus of questions and protests. But Graves silenced them with a single look. "This isn't a debate," he said, his voice steely. "There's something in the forest, something that's waking up. If we stay here, we're all going to die." The townspeople fell silent, their fear now turning to panic. They began to move, some running toward their homes, others standing frozen in shock. Alice felt a pang of guilt. These people had lived in Brackenridge all their lives, and now they were being forced to abandon it, to leave everything behind. But there was no time for guilt, no time for hesitation. The mist was spreading, creeping ever closer to the town. They had to leave, and they had to leave now. Alice and Graves worked together, helping to gather the people, guiding them toward the main road out of town. But as they moved, Alice couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. The whispers were growing louder, the mist thicker, and she could feel the presence of something ancient and malevolent, looming over them, just out of sight. As they reached the edge of town, Alice turned back one last time, looking at the dark, twisted forest that had once seemed so ordinary. The well was still there, still pulsing with that terrible light, and she knew, deep in her bones, that it wasn't going to stop. The darkness had been unleashed, and it was coming for them all. "We need to go," Graves said, his voice shaking with barely suppressed fear. Alice nodded, tearing her gaze away from the forest. She followed the sheriff, joining the fleeing townspeople, but her mind was still in the woods, still fixed on the well and the darkness it was spewing into the world. She didn't know what was coming, but she knew it was something beyond their worst nightmares. The Black Shuck had tried to warn them, to protect them, and they hadn't listened. Now all they could do was run. The road out of Brackenridge was narrow and winding, hemmed in by dense trees that seemed to lean closer with every step. The sky above was a dull, oppressive gray, the clouds hanging low as if they were trying to smother the town. Dr. Alice Harper ran alongside the fleeing townspeople, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with fear and adrenaline. They had barely left the town behind when the first tendrils of mist began to seep through the trees, swirling around their feet like grasping hands. The mist was thick, oily, and it moved with a purpose, spreading out in all directions as if it were alive. The whispers were louder now, filling the air with their eerie, dissonant chorus. "We need to move faster," Sheriff Graves shouted, his voice strained as he urged the group forward. "Don't stop. Keep going." The townspeople were in a state of near panic, their faces pale and drawn as they stumbled over the rough ground. Some carried small bags or bundles of belongings, but most had left everything behind in their rush to escape. Children cried, their voices high and frightened, while the adults whispered prayers under their breath. Alice tried to keep her focus, but it was difficult. The mist was closing in, thickening around them, and with it came a sense of dread that gnawed at her insides. It felt like the darkness was alive, like it was hunting them, and no matter how fast they ran, it was always just behind them, ready to pounce. And then, from somewhere deep within the mist, came the growl. It was low and guttural, vibrating through the ground and into Alice's bones. It was a sound she recognized all too well, the Black Shuck. But this time there was something different about it, something more feral, more menacing. The growl was no longer just a warning, it was a promise. Alice's breath hitched as she glanced over her shoulder, her eyes straining to see through the thick fog. The trees were nothing more than dark shapes in the mist, their twisted branches reaching out like claws. But then she saw it, just a glimpse, a flash of black fur, and those burning red eyes, glowing like embers in the gloom. "It's coming," Alice shouted, her voice cracking with fear. "Run." The group broke into a sprint, feet pounding the dirt road, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The children were carried, their cries lost in the wind, while the adults pushed themselves to the limit, desperation giving them speed they didn't know they had. The Black Shuck was closer than ever before. Alice could feel its presence, the way the air seemed to grow colder, heavier, the closer it got. The whispers in the mist grew frantic, overlapping, as if they were trying to tell her something, but she couldn't make out the words. The road twisted and turned, and the group followed it blindly, driven by fear. But no matter how fast they ran, the mist kept pace, swirling around them, seeping into their lungs, their minds. And within that mist, the Black Shuck hunted them, its growl growing louder, more insistent. Alice stumbled over a root, her ankle twisting painfully, but she forced herself to keep going, biting back a cry of pain. She couldn't afford to stop, not now. The darkness was closing in, and if she fell behind, she knew she wouldn't get back up. Graves was at the front of the group, his face set in grim determination as he led them through the twisting road. But even he was beginning to falter, his breath coming in harsh gasps, his eyes wide with fear. He had been the town's protector for years, but this was beyond anything he had ever faced. The mist thickened, the air turning icy cold, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. Alice's heart raced, her body screaming for rest, but there was no rest, no respite. The Black Shuck was nearly upon them, and she could feel its breath on her neck, could almost hear the pounding of its massive paws on the ground. And then, up ahead, the road opened into a wide clearing, the trees pulling back to reveal a large, flat expanse of land. The group spilled into the clearing, their footsteps echoing on the hard ground, and for a moment the mist seemed to hesitate, as if it had lost track of them. But the moment of reprieve was short-lived. The growl came again, louder this time, and Alice knew that the Black Shuck had found them. It was in the clearing with them, hidden somewhere within the fog, its eyes burning bright with malevolent intent. The townspeople huddled together in the center of the clearing, their fear palpable. Graves stood at the front, his shotgun in hand, but even he knew that the weapon was useless against what was coming. Alice moved to his side, her heart pounding, her mind racing for a solution. "We can't outrun it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We have to face it." Graves nodded, though the fear in his eyes was clear. "What do we do?" Alice swallowed hard, her mind grasping for any shred of hope. She remembered the old man's words, the ritual that had failed, and the darkness that had been unleashed. But there was one thing she hadn't tried, one last desperate hope. "The well," she said, her voice shaking with the weight of the realization. "We have to close the well." Graves looked at her, confusion and fear warring on his face. "How? We're miles away from the well." Alice shook her head, her mind racing. "No, we're not. The well. It's not just in the forest. It's here, too. It's everywhere the mist touches. It's the source of all this." The growl came again, closer now, and the mist began to swirl, faster and faster, like a vortex forming in the center of the clearing. The Black Shuck was here, somewhere within the fog, and it was waiting for them to make a move. "We need to draw it out," Alice said, her voice filled with determination she didn't fully feel. "If we can get it to reveal itself, maybe, just maybe, we can force it back, close the well and seal whatever's coming through." Graves nodded, though his eyes were still filled with doubt. But there was no time for hesitation. The mist was closing in, the whispers growing louder, and the Black Shuck was nearly upon them. Alice took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to do. She stepped forward, away from the group, and into the swirling mist. The cold bit into her skin, the whispers almost deafening, but she kept moving, her eyes scanning the fog for any sign of the creature. "Come on," she shouted, her voice echoing through the clearing. "Come and get me." The growl responded, deep and menacing, and the mist swirled faster, the vortex tightening around her. But Alice didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her heart pounding, waiting for the Black Shuck to show itself. And then, just as she thought the mist would swallow her whole, she saw them, those burning red eyes, glowing like embers in the fog. The Black Shuck stepped out of the mist, its massive form towering over her, its fur bristling with dark energy. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The whispers fell silent, the mist stilled, and Alice locked eyes with the creature. She could feel its power, its malevolent intent, but she also sensed something else, something ancient, something that had been locked away for a reason. She took a step back, her mind racing. The well, the mist, the Black Shuck, it was all connected, all part of the same ancient force. And if she could just figure out how to close the well, how to seal the gate, then maybe, just maybe, she could stop this. But before she could act, the Black Shuck lunged, its jaws wide open, its eyes burning with fury. Alice threw herself to the ground, the creature's claws just missing her as it passed overhead. She scrambled to her feet, her mind racing, her body trembling with fear. The Black Shuck turned, its eyes locked on her, and she knew it was coming for her again. But this time she was ready. She reached into her pocket, pulling out the small vial of salt she had taken from the old man's cabin. It was a last-ditch effort, a hope that the salt, an ancient symbol of purity, might hold some power against the creature. As the Black Shuck lunged again, Alice threw the salt at it, the grains scattering in the air. The creature recoiled, its eyes blazing with rage, and for a moment the mist seemed to hesitate, the whispers faltering. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Alice took the opportunity to run, sprinting back toward the group, her heart pounding in her chest. The Black Shuck growled, a sound filled with fury and frustration, but it didn't follow. The salt had slowed it down, given them a chance, a small one, but a chance nonetheless. "We need to go," she shouted, her voice filled with urgency. "Now." The group didn't need to be told twice. They turned and ran, their feet pounding the ground, the mist swirling around them but not yet overtaking them. The Black Shuck roared in the distance, its voice echoing through the trees, but Alice didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. They ran until their lungs burned, until their legs felt like they would give out. But they didn't stop, not until they were well away from the clearing, the mist beginning to thin, the whispers fading into the background. Finally they collapsed in a heap, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. The mist was still there, still creeping through the trees, but it had slowed, as if it was struggling to keep up with them. Alice looked around at the group, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes wide with fear. They had survived for now, but she knew it wasn't over. The Black Shuck was still out there, the well still open, and the darkness was still coming. But they had bought themselves some time. And in that time Alice knew she had to find a way to close the gate, to seal the well before it was too late. The chase wasn't over, but for the first time Alice felt a glimmer of hope. The Black Shuck was powerful, but it wasn't invincible. And as long as they kept moving, kept fighting, there was still a chance, a small one, but a chance nonetheless, that they could survive. They had to keep running, and they had to find a way to end this, before the darkness consumed them all. The catacombs beneath Brackenridge were colder than Alice Harper had imagined. The air was damp and heavy, clinging to her skin like a shroud as she descended further into the darkness. The narrow stone stairs wound down into the earth, the walls lined with ancient, crumbling bricks that seemed to close in around her the deeper she went. Her flashlight flickered, casting long, jittery shadows on the walls, but she pressed on, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She had thought it was over. The sacrifice, the light, she had believed that would be the end of it. But instead she had woken up here, in the dark, the echoes of the whispers still ringing in her ears. It was as if the well had pulled her deeper, drawing her into the earth, into the heart of the darkness she had tried so hard to seal away. The stairway finally ended, opening into a low, narrow tunnel that stretched out before her like the throat of some ancient beast. The ceiling was so low that she had to crouch slightly as she walked, the rough stone brushing against her head and shoulders. The air here was even colder, each breath sending a chill through her lungs. The whispers had returned, faint and distant, like echoes carried on the wind. But there was no wind down here, no movement at all, except for her own hesitant steps. The darkness pressed in on her from all sides, and she felt a growing sense of dread gnawing at the edges of her mind. She was deep beneath the earth now, far from the world above, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for her in the shadows. She moved cautiously through the tunnel, the beam of her flashlight revealing more of the same ancient brickwork, now covered in moss and lichen. The walls were slick with moisture, and every now and then she caught a glimpse of something moving in the corner of her eye, a fleeting shadow, a trick of the light. But whenever she turned to look, there was nothing there. Just the empty tunnel, stretching on into the unknown. The whispers grew louder as she walked, more distinct, though she still couldn't make out the words. They seemed to come from all around her, the voices overlapping, blending together into a single dissonant chorus. She quickened her pace, her heart racing, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had to keep moving, had to find the source of the whispers, the source of the darkness that had pulled her down here. The tunnel finally opened into a large, circular chamber. The walls were lined with ancient stone carvings, their details worn away by time, leaving only vague, twisted shapes that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering light. The floor was uneven, covered in a thin layer of dirt and dust, and in the center of the room, a large stone slab lay embedded in the ground, its surface cracked and weathered. Alice approached the slab cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the vast, empty chamber. The whispers were louder here, almost deafening, and as she neared the stone, she could feel the darkness pressing in on her, a heavy, suffocating presence that made it hard to breathe. She knelt beside the slab, brushing away the dirt and dust with trembling hands. There were more carvings here, strange symbols that she didn't recognize, etched into the stone with a precision that seemed out of place in this ancient, crumbling tomb. And in the center of the slab there was a deep, jagged crack, as if the stone had been shattered from within. The whispers reached a fever pitch, filling the chamber with their eerie, discordant voices. Alice clutched her head, trying to block them out, but it was no use. The sound was everywhere, inside her mind, inside her very soul. She could feel the darkness reaching out to her, pulling her deeper, deeper into the earth, into the shadows. And then, as if in response to her thoughts, the stone slab began to move. The ground trembled beneath her as the slab shifted, sliding slowly to the side, revealing a dark, gaping hole in the earth below. The whispers grew louder still, rising to a terrible crescendo as the darkness within the hole seemed to pulse and writhe, a living, breathing entity. Alice stared into the abyss, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind reeling with terror. This was it, the source of the darkness, the heart of the evil that had been unleashed. It was ancient, powerful, and it was waking up. She knew she should run, should turn and flee back up the tunnel, back to the world above. But she couldn't move, couldn't tear her eyes away from the darkness that seemed to beckon her, calling her name in a voice that was both familiar and utterly alien. The whispers changed, becoming clearer, the voices distinct now, speaking in a language she didn't understand but somehow knew. They were calling to her, urging her to come closer, to step into the darkness, to join them. She took a step forward, her mind screaming at her to stop, to turn back, but her body moved of its own accord. The darkness seemed to reach out to her, tendrils of shadow curling around her feet, pulling her toward the edge of the hole. Another step. The darkness was all around her now, the voices inside her head, inside her very soul. She could feel them, ancient and terrible, their power overwhelming, irresistible. She stood at the edge of the hole, staring down into the abyss. The darkness was alive, a living, breathing thing, and it was hungry. It wanted her, needed her, and she couldn't resist. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and stepped into the darkness. The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, cold and absolute. And then, from the depths of the darkness, a single terrible voice spoke, clear and resonant, filling the chamber with its power. "Welcome, Alice." The darkness closed in around her, and she knew in that moment that she was lost. The descent was complete. Alice Harper awoke to darkness. It was the kind of darkness that swallowed everything, where no light could reach, no hope could flicker. She couldn't see her own hand in front of her face, couldn't even tell if her eyes were open or closed. The air was thick and heavy, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She didn't know where she was or how long she had been there, but she knew she wasn't alone. The whispers were gone. In their place was a silence so deep it felt like a living thing, pressing in on her from all sides. But within that silence she could feel something ancient, something powerful, watching her, waiting for her to waken fully. She tried to move, but her body felt sluggish, as if the darkness had seeped into her very bones, weighing her down. She forced herself to sit up, her heart pounding in her chest, and as she did, a faint light began to glow in the distance, soft and cold, like the light of the moon filtering through fog. The light grew brighter, and with it the shadows around her began to shift and move, revealing the chamber she had entered. The stone walls were smooth and dark, as if they had been carved from the very heart of the earth. Strange symbols were etched into the stone, glowing faintly with the same cold light, and in the center of the chamber, a massive stone altar stood, its surface cracked and weathered with age. But it was what lay beyond the altar that made Alice's breath catch in her throat. A figure stood there, cloaked in shadow, its form tall and imposing. The light didn't seem to touch it, as if the darkness clung to it, like a second skin. But even from where she stood, Alice could see its eyes, two burning points of red, glowing with a malevolent fire that pierced through the gloom. The Black Shuck. But it wasn't just the creature she had seen before. It was something more, something larger and more terrifying. The air around it seemed to ripple with power, and as it stared at her with those burning eyes, Alice felt a cold dread settle over her, more intense than anything she had ever felt before. "You have come far, Alice," the figure said, its voice deep and resonant, echoing through the chamber like the tolling of a bell. "But you have not yet understood the truth." Alice's voice caught in her throat, but she forced herself to speak. "What? What is this place? What are you?" The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, the darkness swirling around it like a living thing. As it moved closer, Alice could see more of it, a tall, cloaked figure, its features hidden in shadow, save for those burning eyes. "This is the heart of the well," it said, its voice soft but filled with an ancient power. "The place where the gate was first opened, where the darkness was first unleashed." Alice shook her head, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. The gate. The well. You were guarding it. But why? What are you guarding against? The figure paused, as if considering her question. "I am the Black Shuck," it said finally. "I was once like you, a mortal who sought to understand the mysteries of the world, but I was drawn to this place, to the power that lay beneath the earth, and in seeking to understand it I became its guardian." Alice stared at the figure, her mind reeling. You were human." "I was," the figure replied, its voice tinged with a sadness that seemed to echo through the chamber. "But that was long ago. I have been here for centuries, bound to this place, to this duty. The well is a gateway, a door between worlds. And on the other side lies a darkness that must never be allowed to enter our world." Alice felt a shudder course through her body. "But the gate, it's opening. The darkness is spreading." "Yes," the figure said, its voice heavy with regret. "When you performed the ritual, you disturbed the balance. The seal that kept the gate closed was weakened, and the darkness began to seep through. I have tried to contain it, but I am no longer strong enough. The well is open, and soon the darkness will be unleashed in full." Alice's heart raced as the full weight of what the figure was saying hit her. The darkness, the whispers, the mist, it was all connected to the well, to the gate. And now, because of her, the world was in danger of being consumed by it. "There must be a way to stop it," Alice said, desperation creeping into her voice. "There must be something we can do." The figure was silent for a long moment, its eyes glowing brighter. "There is one way," it said finally, "but it will require a great sacrifice. The well must be sealed again, and this time it must be done with a life, one that is willingly given." Alice felt her blood run cold. A sacrifice. But I already offered myself to the well. Why didn't it work? The figure's gaze softened, and for the first time Alice thought she saw a glimmer of something human in those burning eyes. "You did offer yourself, but the well requires more than just a willing sacrifice. It requires the blood of the one who opened it, the one who disturbed the balance." Alice's breath caught in her throat. "The blood, you mean?" The figure nodded slowly. "You, Alice. It must be your blood that seals the gate, your life that is given to restore the balance." Alice's mind reeled with the enormity of what she was hearing. She had come here to find answers, to stop the darkness, but now she was being told that the only way to do that was to give up her own life. "There must be another way," she whispered, though she knew deep down that there wasn't. The figure stepped closer, its presence filling the chamber, and Alice felt a strange sense of calm wash over her, as if the darkness itself was wrapping her in its embrace. "There is no other way," the figure said softly. "But know this: in giving your life, you will save countless others. You will close the gate, and the darkness will be sealed away once more. The well will be silent, and the world will be safe." Alice stared at the figure, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. This was it, the truth she had been searching for, the answer to the mystery of the well. And it was a truth she had never wanted to find. But as she stood there, staring into the burning eyes of the Black Shuck, she knew what she had to do. The darkness had to be stopped, and if it meant giving up her own life to do it, then so be it. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. "How do I do it?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. The figure reached out, its hand brushing against hers, and Alice felt a strange warmth spread through her, a connection that went beyond words, beyond thought. "Come with me," the figure said, its voice soft and gentle. "I will guide you." And with that, the figure turned and began to walk toward the altar, the darkness parting before it like a curtain. Alice followed, her steps sure, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what she was about to do. As they reached the altar, the figure turned to her, its eyes glowing with a soft, almost comforting light. "Lie down," it said, its voice barely a whisper, "and close your eyes. The well will do the rest." Alice nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She climbed onto the altar, the stone cold against her skin, and lay down, her eyes staring up at the darkness above. The figure stood over her, its presence filling her with a strange sense of peace. "Thank you, Alice," it said, its voice filled with a quiet reverence. You have done more than you know." Alice closed her eyes, her breath slowing, her mind drifting into the darkness. She felt the warmth of the figure's hand on hers. And then, slowly, she felt herself sinking into the stone, into the earth, into the well. The last thing she heard was the figure's voice, soft and gentle, as it whispered in her ear. "Rest now. The darkness is sealed. The world is safe." And then there was only silence. The town of Brackenridge lay under a shroud of thick, unmoving fog. The streets were empty, silent, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Sheriff Graves stood alone in the town square, staring at the old clock tower that had long since stopped keeping time. His thoughts were heavy, burdened by the events of the past days and the sacrifice that Dr. Alice Harper had made. The townspeople had scattered, fleeing from the darkness that had threatened to consume them all. But Graves had stayed, unable to leave the place he had sworn to protect. Alice's sacrifice had bought them time, had sealed the well and driven the Black Shuck back into the shadows. But the air was still thick with unease, as if the darkness had only been pushed back, not truly defeated. Graves ran a hand over his tired face, feeling the weight of his years more acutely than ever before. He had lost good people, friends and neighbors to the Black Shuck, and the memory of their faces haunted him. And now Alice was gone too, swallowed by the very darkness she had sought to stop. The town felt empty without her, hollow and incomplete. He had tried to convince himself that her sacrifice was not in vain, that she had truly stopped the evil that had plagued Brackenridge. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. He turned and began to walk toward the edge of town, his boots crunching on the gravel path. The fog swirled around him, thick and cold, obscuring the way ahead. He wasn't sure where he was going, but his feet seemed to know the way, guiding him toward the forest, toward the place where it had all begun. The trees loomed out of the fog like specters, their branches twisted and gnarled. Graves paused at the tree line, staring into the darkness that lay beyond. The mist clung to the ground, swirling lazily around the roots of the trees, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth. He took a deep breath and stepped into the forest, the shadows closing in around him. The path was narrow and uneven, the ground soft beneath his feet. The whispers had faded, the voices of the forest silent, but the sense of unease only grew stronger as he walked deeper into the woods. He didn't know how long he had been walking when he heard it, a soft rustle, like the sound of leaves being disturbed. He stopped, his hand instinctively going to the shotgun slung over his shoulder. He peered into the darkness, his eyes straining to see through the fog. And then he saw her. A figure emerged from the mist, moving slowly and deliberately toward him. For a moment he thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow given form by his tired mind. But as she stepped closer, the fog parted, and Graves felt his breath catch in his throat. It was Alice. She was pale, her skin almost translucent in the dim light, her hair hanging limp around her face. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her eyes wide and vacant, as if she had been walking through the forest for days. But there was something else, something in the way she moved, in the way her eyes locked onto his, that sent a chill down his spine. "Alice," he whispered, his voice barely audible. She didn't respond, just kept walking toward him, her steps slow and deliberate. Graves took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. Something was wrong. This wasn't the Alice he had known. As she drew closer, he could see the faint glow of red in her eyes, a light that flickered and pulsed with a malevolent energy. It was the same light he had seen in the eyes of the Black Shuck, and it filled him with a cold, gnawing dread. "Alice, stop," he said, louder this time, his voice trembling. But she didn't stop. She kept coming, her eyes locked on his, the glow growing brighter, more intense. Graves raised his shotgun, his hands shaking, but he couldn't bring himself to pull the trigger. This was Alice, the woman who had sacrificed herself to save them all. He couldn't believe she was gone, couldn't accept that she had become something else, something twisted and wrong. "Alice, please," he whispered, his voice breaking. And then, just as she was within arm's reach, she stopped. The light in her eyes flared, and Graves felt a wave of cold wash over him, freezing him in place. She reached out, her hand brushing against his, and he felt a jolt of energy, like a surge of electricity, race through his body. Her touch was cold, colder than anything he had ever felt, and it burned like ice. He tried to pull away, but his body refused to obey, locked in place by her gaze, by the power that radiated from her. And then she spoke. "Graves," she whispered, her voice hollow, devoid of warmth or emotion. "You have to understand." The words sent a shiver down his spine. This wasn't Alice. This was something else, something that had taken her place, something that had been born from the darkness of the well. "You were supposed to protect the town," she continued, her voice soft but filled with a terrible, unearthly power. "But you failed. You let the darkness in. You let it take me." Graves shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. "I tried, Alice. I tried to stop it." "You can't stop it," she whispered, her voice growing colder, more distant. "The darkness is here, and it's not going to leave. Not ever." She leaned in closer, her breath cold against his skin, and Graves felt the energy drain from his body, his strength fading as the darkness seeped into him, filling him with a deep, suffocating despair. "But you can join it," she said, her voice a soft, seductive whisper. "You can become part of it. You can be with me forever." Graves felt his mind slipping, his thoughts becoming muddled, confused. He wanted to resist, to fight against the pull of the darkness, but it was so strong, so overwhelming. And Alice, this twisted, corrupted version of Alice, was right there, offering him a way out, a way to end the pain. "All you have to do is let go," she whispered, her voice echoing in his mind. "Let go, and come with me." Graves closed his eyes, his breath shallow, his heart slowing in his chest. He could feel the darkness closing in around him, could feel the cold, empty void that awaited him if he let go. But deep down, beneath the despair and the fear, there was a flicker of something else, something small, but strong. A memory, a promise he had made to himself long ago. He had sworn to protect Brackenridge, to keep the people safe, no matter what. He had failed before, but he couldn't let that happen again. He couldn't let the darkness win. With a surge of willpower, Graves pulled back, wrenching himself away from Alice's grasp. The effort sent him stumbling backward, his heart racing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Alice's eyes flared with anger, the red glow intensifying, but she didn't move. She just stood there, watching him with those burning eyes, her expression unreadable. "You can't escape it," she whispered, her voice cold and empty. "The darkness is inside you now. It will always be inside you." Graves shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I won't let it take me," he said, his voice trembling. "I won't let it take you." With a final, pained look at the figure that had once been Alice, Graves turned and ran, his feet pounding the forest floor as he fled back toward the town, toward the safety of the light. But as he ran, he could still hear her voice, whispering in his mind, cold and relentless. "You can't run from the darkness. It's already inside you, and it's never going to leave." Graves kept running, but he knew, deep down, that Alice was right. The darkness had taken root in his soul, and no matter how far he ran, no matter how hard he fought, it would always be there, waiting for him. And it would never let him go. Sheriff Graves stumbled back into Brackenridge just as the last light of day was slipping below the horizon. The town was cloaked in shadow, the fog rolling in thick and heavy, clinging to the ground like a living thing. The once familiar streets now felt alien, every corner hiding something dark and unseen. He could still hear Alice's voice in his head, that cold whisper promising the darkness would never leave him. But he couldn't let it consume him, not yet. There was still one thing left to do. The few remaining townspeople had gathered in the square, huddled together in the cold twilight. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear. They had heard the whispers, felt the darkness creeping in around them. They knew something terrible was coming, and they were right. Graves pushed his way through the crowd, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the darkness inside him, gnawing at the edges of his mind, but he forced it down, focusing on the task at hand, the well. It was all connected to the well. That was where it had begun, and that was where it had to end. "We need to go to the well," Graves said, his voice rough and urgent. "It's the source of all of this. If we're going to stop the darkness, we have to seal it for good." The townspeople exchanged nervous glances, their fear palpable. They had heard the stories, knew what had happened to Alice, knew what the well represented. But they also knew that Graves was right. If they didn't act now, the darkness would consume them all. Graves looked around at the faces of the people he had sworn to protect, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what he was about to ask of them. "This is our last chance," he said, his voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at him. "If we don't stop it now, we won't get another chance." Slowly, reluctantly, the townspeople nodded. They knew they had no choice. The darkness was closing in, and if they didn't fight back, it would swallow them whole. Graves led the way through the fog-shrouded streets, the cold air biting at his skin. The whispers had returned, faint but persistent, like a distant chorus of voices carried on the wind. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the air with a sense of dread that made it hard to breathe. As they neared the edge of the forest, the mist thickened, swirling around them like a living thing. The trees loomed out of the fog, dark and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Graves could feel the darkness growing stronger, could feel it pulling at him, trying to drag him down into the shadows. But he kept going, kept moving forward, driven by a desperate need to end this once and for all. The well was waiting for them, just as it had been before. The stone was cold and ancient, the symbols etched into its surface glowing faintly in the dim light. The crack in the center of the slab yawned like a mouth, a void that seemed to swallow all light and sound. Graves stepped up to the edge of the well, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the darkness pulsing beneath the earth, a malevolent presence that had been waiting, watching, for centuries. This was the source of the evil that had plagued Brackenridge, the heart of the darkness that had consumed Alice and so many others. He turned to face the townspeople, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. "We need to close the well," he said, his voice carrying over the whispers that filled the air. "We need to seal it for good, or the darkness will never leave us." The townspeople gathered around the well, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. They knew what was at stake, knew what had to be done. But as they stared into the darkness below, they felt the same gnawing dread that had consumed Graves. "What do we do?" one of them asked, his voice trembling. Graves looked down at the well, his mind racing. He knew the darkness had to be sealed, but he didn't know how. The ritual had failed, Alice's sacrifice had failed. What was left? And then, as if in answer, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The ground beneath them trembled, the air growing colder, heavier, as if the very earth was trying to swallow them whole. The darkness was rising, pushing its way up through the crack in the well, ready to break free. Graves felt a surge of fear, but he pushed it down, focusing on the one thing he knew for sure. The well had been sealed before, and it had to be sealed again. But this time it wouldn't be enough to just close it. This time they had to make sure it stayed closed forever. "We need to use the symbols," Graves said, his voice urgent. "The ones on the slab. They're the key. They were put there to seal the well, to keep the darkness contained. The townspeople exchanged nervous glances, but they nodded. They had come this far, and they couldn't turn back now. Together they began to gather stones, dirt, and whatever else they could find, using them to cover the well, to press down on the crack and seal it shut. But as they worked, the darkness fought back. The ground shook beneath them, the air growing colder, the whispers rising to a deafening roar. The well seemed to pulse with a terrible energy, the symbols on the slab glowing brighter, more intense, as if they were resisting their efforts. Graves gritted his teeth, his hands shaking as he pushed another stone into place. The darkness was strong, stronger than he had imagined, but he couldn't let it win. Not now, not when they were so close. "Keep going," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the whispers. "We can do this." The townspeople worked frantically, their fear driving them, giving them strength. But no matter how hard they tried, the darkness kept pushing back, the well refusing to be sealed. And then, just as they were about to give up hope, there was a blinding flash of light. The symbols on the slab flared with a brilliant, white light, so intense that it burned the darkness away, pushing it back into the well, back into the earth. The ground stopped shaking, the whispers fell silent, and the air grew still. The well was sealed, the darkness trapped beneath the earth once more. Graves fell to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. It was over. They had done it. The darkness was sealed, the town was safe. But as he looked around at the exhausted, terrified faces of the townspeople, he knew that nothing would ever be the same. They had won, but it had come at a terrible cost. The darkness had been driven back, but it had left its mark on them all. They would never forget the horrors they had faced, the lives that had been lost. And Graves knew, deep down, that the darkness wasn't truly gone. It was still there, buried deep beneath the earth, waiting for the day when it would be strong enough to break free again. But for now the well was sealed, and Brackenridge was safe. They had made their final stand, and they had survived, and that was all that mattered. The night was cold and silent, the air heavy with the scent of earth and decay. Brackenridge lay in uneasy stillness, the fog creeping through the streets like a living thing. Sheriff Graves stood alone at the edge of the town, staring into the dark line of trees that marked the beginning of the forest. The well was sealed, the darkness contained, for now. But the victory felt hollow, like a reprieve rather than a true end. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left undone, something vital. The darkness still lingered in the air, a silent threat that hung over the town like a storm cloud, ready to break at any moment. The well might be sealed, but the danger hadn't passed. And deep down, Graves knew there was one final act that had to be carried out, one last step to ensure the darkness would never return. He turned away from the forest and began to walk back toward the town square. The streets were empty, the houses dark, the people hiding behind locked doors and drawn curtains, too afraid to venture out. They were safe, but they were also haunted, knowing that their lives had been forever changed by the events of the past days. Graves walked slowly, his thoughts heavy. Alice's sacrifice had sealed the well, but it hadn't truly stopped the darkness. It had merely pushed it back, buried it deep beneath the earth, and it was only a matter of time before it found a way to escape again. He had to make sure that didn't happen. He had to make a choice. As he reached the town square, Graves paused, looking up at the old clock tower that stood in the center. The hands were frozen at midnight, the face cracked and weathered by time. The clock had stopped long ago, but tonight it felt like a symbol, a reminder that time was running out. The darkness had been held back, but it wasn't defeated. Not yet. Graves took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he knew he had to do. There was only one way to ensure the darkness would never return. The well needed more than just a seal. It needed a guardian, someone to watch over it, to keep the darkness contained forever. And Graves knew that person had to be him. He made his way back to the edge of the forest, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The fog swirled around his legs, cold and damp, as if the earth itself was trying to hold him back, to stop him from carrying out his final task. But he kept going, driven by a sense of duty, a need to protect the town he had sworn to defend. The forest was dark and quiet, the trees standing like sentinels, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The path to the well was familiar now, etched into his memory by fear and desperation. But this time there was no fear, no hesitation. Graves knew what he had to do. The well was waiting for him, the stone slab still cracked, but the symbols etched into its surface glowing faintly in the darkness. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of earth and something else, something older, darker, that lurked just beneath the surface. Graves knelt beside the well, his heart heavy with the weight of what he was about to do. He had spent his life protecting Brackenridge, and now he was going to give his life to protect it forever. It was a sacrifice, but it was one he was willing to make. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, sharp knife he had brought with him. The blade glinted in the faint light, cold and unforgiving. Graves took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He knew there was no turning back, no second chances. This was the end. With a steady hand, Graves pressed the blade to his palm, the cold metal biting into his skin. He winced as the knife cut through flesh, blood welling up from the wound, dark and thick. He watched as the blood dripped onto the stone, the red staining the ancient symbols etched into the slab. The air around him seemed to shift, the darkness growing thicker, more oppressive. The well pulsed with a strange energy, the crack in the slab glowing faintly, as if it were alive, hungry for what he was offering. Graves closed his eyes, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He could feel the darkness pressing in on him, could feel it reaching out, trying to pull him in. But he didn't resist. This was what he had come here to do, what he had always known he would have to do. He whispered a final prayer, not for himself, but for the town, for the people he was leaving behind. He prayed that they would be safe, that the darkness would never touch them again. And then, with a final, deep breath, he plunged the knife into his heart. The pain was sharp, blinding, but it was over quickly. The darkness closed in around him, cold and suffocating, and Graves felt himself slipping away, sinking into the earth, into the well. But as the darkness took him, he felt something else, something warm, comforting. It was the light, the same light that had sealed the well before. It wrapped around him, pulling him deeper, deeper into the darkness, until there was nothing left but light and silence. And then there was peace. The well was sealed. The darkness was contained. And Sheriff Graves, the last guardian of Brackenridge, was gone. But the town was safe. For now, and for as long as the light held. The morning after Sheriff Graves' sacrifice dawned in a muted gray, the sun struggling to break through the dense clouds that hung low over Brackenridge. The fog, which had so stubbornly clung to the town for days, had finally begun to lift, leaving behind a damp stillness that settled over the empty streets. The town square, where the people had once gathered in fear, was now deserted. The clock tower, frozen at midnight, stood as a silent sentinel, a reminder of the darkness they had narrowly escaped. But there was no celebration, no relief, only a quiet, lingering unease, as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The few remaining townspeople emerged slowly from their homes, their faces pale and drawn. They moved through the streets like ghosts, their eyes scanning the horizon, as if expecting the darkness to return at any moment. But the forest remained quiet, the mist dissipating, the trees standing still and silent. At the edge of the town, near the path leading into the forest, a small group had gathered. They stood in a loose circle, their heads bowed, their voices hushed. In the center of the circle, where Sheriff Graves had made his final stand, A simple wooden cross had been placed in the ground, marking the spot where he had given his life to protect them. They had found him there, at the edge of the well, his body cold and still, his eyes closed as if in sleep. There was no sign of the darkness that had threatened to consume them all, only the faint glow of the symbols on the stone slab. The well sealed once more. The townspeople stood in silence, their grief heavy in the air. Graves had been their protector, their guide through the darkest days, and now he was gone. They didn't know what the future held, didn't know if the darkness would return. But for now they were safe, and that was all they could ask for. One by one, the people began to drift away, leaving the cross and the well behind. They returned to their homes, to their families, to the lives they had almost lost. But as they went, a sense of unease lingered, a fear that the peace they had won was only temporary. At the edge of the group, a young girl lingered, her eyes fixed on the cross. She was small, no more than 10 years old, with wide, solemn eyes that seemed to take in everything. She had seen the darkness, felt its cold touch, and she knew that it wasn't truly gone. She knelt by the cross, her small hands brushing against the rough wood. The ground beneath her was soft and damp, the earth still holding the memory of the man who had died to protect them. She whispered a quiet prayer, her voice barely audible, and then rose to her feet, her eyes fixed on the well. The symbols on the stone slab glowed faintly in the dim light, a soft, pulsating rhythm that seemed to echo in the stillness. The girl stared at them, her brow furrowed in concentration, as if trying to understand something just out of reach. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know if the darkness would return. But she knew one thing for certain, the well was still there, still pulsing with a quiet, ominous energy. It was a reminder that the darkness had not been defeated, only held at bay. As she turned to leave, the girl glanced back at the cross, at the path leading into the forest, and felt a shiver run down her spine. The town was safe for now, but she knew that the darkness was always there, waiting, just beneath the surface. And she knew that one day it would return. The girl walked back to the town, her steps slow and deliberate. The fog had lifted, the sun beginning to break through the clouds, casting a pale light over the streets. But even as the town warmed under the light of the sun, the girl couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were still watching, still waiting. The people of Brackenridge would rebuild, would return to their lives, but they would never forget the darkness that had nearly consumed them. They would never forget the sacrifice that had been made to keep them safe. And they would never forget the well, sealed now, but always there, a reminder of the darkness that lay just beneath the surface, waiting for its chance to break free once more. As the girl reached the town square, she paused, her eyes scanning the horizon one last time. The fog had almost completely disappeared, the sky growing brighter, the town coming back to life. But she knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The well was sealed. The darkness was contained, but it was not gone. And Brackenridge would never truly be free. Years had passed since the events that had nearly consumed Brackenridge. The town had rebuilt, its streets filled once more with the sounds of everyday life. The fog that had once clung so stubbornly to the town had long since lifted, replaced by clear skies and warm sunlight. To a passer-by, Brackenridge seemed like any other small, sleepy town, a place where time moved slowly and the past was easily forgotten. But for those who lived there, the past was never far away. The memory of the darkness that had nearly claimed their town lingered in the minds of the older generation, a shadow that never quite lifted. They spoke of it in hushed tones, when they spoke of it at all, and the well at the edge of the forest was left undisturbed, a place avoided by all but the bravest, or the most foolish. The young girl who had knelt by the cross on that fateful day had grown into a young woman. Her name was Emily, and she had inherited her father's shop, a small, cozy place in the heart of town where people came to buy groceries and catch up on the latest news. She was well-liked, known for her kindness and her quiet strength, but there was something in her eyes, something old and wise, as if she carried the weight of a secret too heavy to share. Emily had never forgotten the darkness. She had never forgotten the well, or the strange symbols that had glowed with an otherworldly light. She had never forgotten Sheriff Graves, the man who had given his life to seal the well, to protect them all from a fate too terrible to imagine. And she had never forgotten the feeling that the darkness wasn't truly gone. It was late one evening when the first whispers began. Emily was closing up the shop, the sun just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street. The day had been quiet, uneventful, but as she turned the key in the lock, a chill raced down her spine, a cold breeze that seemed to come from nowhere. She paused, her hand on the door, and listened. The street was empty, the town quiet, but there, just at the edge of hearing, was a sound, a soft, distant whisper, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, or the murmur of voices carried on a breeze. Emily's heart skipped a beat. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but she knew it well. It was the same whisper she had heard as a child, the same whisper that had filled the air on the night the well was sealed. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the street, but there was nothing there, just the empty road, the darkening sky, the old clock tower standing tall against the fading light. But the whisper continued, growing louder, more insistent, as if calling her name. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the rising fear in her chest. It couldn't be happening again. The well was sealed, the darkness contained. It was over. But as the whisper grew louder, she knew that the darkness had never truly left. Without thinking, Emily began to walk. Her footsteps echoed on the cobblestone street, the sound sharp in the stillness. The whisper guided her, pulling her toward the edge of town, toward the path that led into the forest. She hesitated at the tree line, the memories of that terrible night flooding back. The forest was dark, the trees twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. But the whisper urged her on, and she couldn't resist its pull. The path to the well was overgrown, the stones slick with moss and rain. The trees closed in around her as she walked, the darkness thickening, the air growing colder. The whisper was louder now, a chorus of voices blending together, filling her mind, her soul. And then she was there. The well stood in the center of the clearing, just as it had years ago. The stone slab was still cracked, the symbols etched into its surface faint but visible. The air around it was heavy, the ground beneath her feet soft and damp. The darkness pulsed beneath the earth, alive and waiting. Emily approached the well, her heart pounding in her chest. The whisper was deafening now, a relentless murmur that filled the air, the same words repeated over and over, too faint to understand but too loud to ignore. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold stone, and the whisper stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, suffocating stillness that pressed down on her from all sides. For a moment she thought it was over. The darkness was gone, the well was sealed. But then, from deep within the earth, she heard it, the low, guttural growl that had haunted her nightmares for years. The Black Shuck. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. The growl rumbled through the ground, vibrating up through her feet, filling the air with its terrible, menacing power. The darkness was still there, still alive, and it was waking up. She took a step back, her heart racing, her mind screaming at her to run. But she couldn't move, couldn't tear her eyes away from the well, from the darkness that seemed to rise up from its depths, swirling and pulsing like a living thing. And then from the shadows she saw them, two glowing red eyes burning with a fierce, malevolent light. The Black Shuck stepped out of the darkness, its massive form towering over her, its eyes locked onto hers. For a moment the world seemed to stop. Emily could feel the darkness closing in around her, could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her, the weight of the secret she had carried for so long. The well was sealed, but the darkness had never truly left. It had been waiting, biding its time, and now it was ready to break free. But Emily wasn't the same frightened child she had been all those years ago. She had grown, had learned, had prepared for this moment. She knew what had to be done. With a deep breath, she stepped forward, her eyes locked on the Black Shuck. The darkness surged around her, the growl growing louder, more intense. But she didn't falter. She had been given a gift that night, a gift of knowledge, of understanding. And she knew that the only way to truly seal the well was to confront the darkness head-on. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver pendant, the same one her mother had given her before she died, the one she had worn every day since. The pendant was simple, unadorned, but it held a power, a light that the darkness could never touch. Holding the pendant high, Emily stepped closer to the well, her voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at her insides. "This ends now," she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet determination. The Black Shuck growled, its eyes flaring with a fierce, angry light, but it didn't move. It watched her, waiting, as if it knew that the final battle was about to begin. Emily closed her eyes, her breath steady, her heart calm. She could feel the darkness around her, could feel it pressing in on her, but she didn't give in. She focused on the light, on the pendant in her hand, and she let it fill her with warmth, with strength. And then, with a final deep breath, she threw the pendant into the well. The darkness roared, the growl of the Black Shuck filling the air, but the light from the pendant flared, brighter than the sun, burning away the shadows, the darkness, the fear. Emily stumbled back, shielding her eyes from the brilliant light. The ground trembled beneath her, the air crackling with energy, and for a moment she thought she would be consumed by it all. But then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The light faded, the ground stilled, and the air grew calm. Emily opened her eyes, blinking in the sudden quiet. The well was silent, the darkness gone. The Black Shuck had disappeared, leaving only the faint echo of its growl in the stillness. She stared at the well, her heart pounding, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The pendant was gone, but the well was sealed, truly sealed this time. The darkness had been banished and Brackenridge was safe. Emily let out a long, slow breath, the tension draining from her body. It was over. The legend of the Black Shuck, the darkness that had haunted Brackenridge for so long, was finally put to rest. But as she turned to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was never truly gone. It had been defeated, for now, but it would always be there, waiting, just beneath the surface. And she knew, deep down, that the legend would continue. But for tonight, Brackenridge was safe. And that was enough.